Hello everyone. Are you as a leader satisfied with your team's performance? Is your team clear on the goals they have to achieve? And do team members understand the purpose of that goal? Thank you for joining us today on the Humanizing Management Podcast. I'm Tony Raghunandan and I'm here with Edwin Martinez. In this podcast, we explore the factors that make teams work and we share tools and ideas that you could use to improve your team's performance. So Edwin, thanks again for joining me. Let's get into it.
Pleasure to be back.
All right. So what can we say about teams?
Oh my God. Where should we start? There's a lot of stuff going around, usually the usual cliches when we talk about teams, the team development and all that. I would rather we invest this conversation in talking more about how in the performance management process that we have been discussing so far in our previous 3 videos. Now that I have developed this relationship and managing the performance of each individual in my group, how can I make this a better team? How do I take those individual elements that I have discovered and I'm trying to develop? How can I combine them and get the best out of them to produce synergy?
Right, and synergy. That's an important word. What does synergy mean exactly?
To me, it's a very simple explanation. I usually say it's when 1 + 1 = 3. So it's actually when the sum of the part, when the end result of whatever you're doing is greater than the sum of its parts. That's why it's very important to distinguish between a group of people working together and a team. Because in a team, the individual is responsible for his results and for the results of the group as a whole as well. In a group, not so. In a group, you're just responsible for your own results, and that's it. You're not responsible for the other people's results. So that is why you need to understand that combining what you've learned so far about everybody's strengths and weaknesses could help you provide that synergy so that you can have a result that's beyond the sum of the parts.
Okay, good. Now, one thing I wanted to just separate from what we want to discuss today. In the previous podcast, we discussed the importance of competencies and alignment between competencies and goals. That is in podcast 1. In podcast 2, we talked about conversations and conversations to make competencies work. In podcast 3, we talked about the benefits of feedback and why that is important. So we're going to assume that all of these things are in place already. So now what we focus on is, as a group, what do we need to think about?
I've had some clients that find it useful at this point to use some kind of psychometric testing to find out what the strengths and needs of their team members are. Not everyone does this. Psychometric test is not a panacea, but it could help you define from an objective point of view what those strengths are so you can try to combine them together. There are some companies out there that have special testing for teams and how to make that team effort work well together. So it's something to think about because it's really on the leader's shoulder to make the best of what their people are doing. Now, one thing is to have someone develop so that they could produce whatever they need to do in a proper way and be happy about it. And another is to have the team having those same results. So you need to think in terms of, okay, how do I bring these things together? And it's a delicate kind of responsibility. Sure. There's an important point that everyone that leads a group of people need to keep in mind. Not every group of people that's working with you should become a team. We tend to think that every time we're dealing with a bunch of people, that has to become a team. Well, not necessarily so. For example, I've done some work with groups of people that report to the same person, but they will never constitute a team because they're not responsible for the whole team's results. So it's important for the person who's leading people to identify whether that group of people that he's leading or she's leading actually needs to become a team where that synergy needs to be produced. And not all situations are like that. I have made that mistake before, thought that a group of people should become a team. I was struggling very hard for them to find the elements that we will discuss in a minute about what makes a team and how you can produce synergy. But in fact, all they were doing was each of them were responsible for a particular area, and all they had to do was really make sure that their areas were producing the right results.
Right. That is a perfect example. That in sales you see that happening. If you are responsible for one area and another person is responsible for another area, then sometimes they for one to be successful, it doesn't depend on another one. But I know that some companies have a commission structure that pays for the team goal as well as individual goal.
Yes, because the fact that I'm not responsible for the team's result doesn't mean that I don't have to be responsible to the major goals that the company is seeking. Everyone in the company is responsible for the goals that the company is seeking. So that doesn't disqualify that. The problem is when I think that this particular group of people has to produce synergy, to do something beyond, so I can achieve those results that the company is looking for. Maybe some way to clarify that is to think, I think it's Katzenbach in his book, in one of his books, says that there are three categories of teams out there. There are teams that are really there to recommend something. Usually this type of team is temporary. They are given a particular issue to debate or to elucidate, and then they produce a recommendation. Obviously, that's a limited time, but it's a team. They have to produce particular result, and that result has to be better than the individual results of the people in that group.
Right.
The other type of, or the other classification for teams is teams that do or make something. Okay, I think in terms of manufacturing, but not only in manufacturing. These are teams that work daily to make something or to do something. It could be services, it could be manufacturing, but they always working to do or make something. Obviously, those are more permanent in their permanence. You know, they're more permanent in their structure and their execution, but it's still strong ties, and they are responsible for the team's element. And sometimes what one part does will affect immediately the other part of that team. So right. That's another kind. And then there's a last one that he says it's when teams run something. Okay, and he distinguishes between doing or making something which has some sort of finished product, and teams that run something. Again, this one is also long term, and you have to try to find synergy, because when you run something, the end result should be bigger or greater than the particular pieces that component. So Katzenbach gives us those three categories that I think would clear your mind in order to say, well, should I put my group of people into the stresses of becoming a team and try to produce synergy? Is it necessary here? And you will find that will make a big distinction, which I hardly see people talking about out there.
But regardless of the type of team it is, some of the elements of the elements to consider remain the same in terms of clarity, purpose, and psychological safety. Clarity is the what. We have to know what we're going to be clear on. The purpose is the why, and this is a question I ask often with teams. Why is this important? And I find that a lot of times people don't understand the why. And lastly, psychological safety. And psychological safety has a lot to do with the interaction between leader and the direct reports that report to him or her.
Sure, and those three elements, by the way, that you bring, clarity, purpose, and psychological safety, is used by some firms out there as their tenet to provide services, because they have found in their research, Berkman International is one, for example. It's the main one for me that does that. They really, through their studies, found out that those three key elements are important to produce the synergy that any team needs to work on. And as you say, I love the way you put it. The why, the how, and the what are there included in those three elements. We have to keep in mind, we've talked about psychologically safety before. In the case of a team, that psychologically safety has to do with what I think of two wheels that every single team leader has to deal with. On the one side, you have the structure of the team, the goals of the team, and all that mechanical side of the team, okay? The measuring of the results. But then there's this other wheel that the leader has to keep in mind, which has to do with the interpersonal relationships, and the rules that they're going to follow as a team. Right. I seldom see a team that sits down and say, before we get into work, let's define how are we going to deal with differences? How are we going to deal with conflict? What are we going to do when we disagree with each other? What's acceptable? What's not acceptable? that is hardly discussed. And if it's not discussed, then that psychological safety area is blown. So you're missing something, and to reach synergy, that will be almost impossible.
Right. Okay, so let's go to clarity first. What do you see as clarity?
We have to keep in mind what we've spoken before about the conversations that we have to have with every single one of the people that work with us.
Right.
That we're holding that true even in the team. So the clarity has to do with the goals that as a team we want, but it also has to do with exactly what I am expecting from you as a member of this team, not just as an employee of mine, but as a member of this particular team that's doing this particular thing, or running this thing, or making this thing, or doing this thing. Using the definitions we used before. Now, there's a clarity of role that needs to be there, and the role sometimes is just. Sometimes you have to have people who are task oriented, people who are process oriented, people who are extroverts, introverts. You have all this gap. That's why I said at the beginning, now that you have all those particular or individual evaluations and you know their development needs and all that, how do you bring this together? It's like a jazz orchestra and a director trying to lead a jazz band. Where everyone has their own liberties, but at the same time, there has to be synchronicity.
Yes.
It has to be beautiful music anyway. So that clarity has to do not only with that's central. Goal of the team is a tenet. You stand on that. But
Right.
now I have to go back and say, okay, who's going to do what,
Yeah.
and what is the role, and not only in terms of mechanical or procedural stuff, but also with the interrelational stuff. There are people who are amiable. There are people who are more directive. There are people, personal styles started creating frictions. I've seen this a lot because people don't have clarity on the roles or on the differences or diversity that's needed in the team.
Right.
They don't like the way someone speaks. And every time they are against whatever someone else is saying, you would get irritated because you don't like the way they say that. Well, that happens because we have not discussed that. We have not developed those elements that are so necessary for us to have clarity.
Okay, so let's get into purpose. The way I always talk about purpose in my classes is I use an analogy. It's a popular analogy I use all the time in sales or customer service. If two sisters are fighting for an orange, what's the best solution? Well, people go all in all directions. Well, share it. Don't give anybody any. Get another one. But the real answer here is really ask why they want it, and what if one person wants it to eat the orange and the other one wants it for the skin peel to make a cake, then do we need to cut it in half? Both can have the orange. But you only get to that solution if you ask why. And important, just an analogy I use just to get people to understand the importance of why.
And a good analogy. There are several books out there. Simon Sinek being one of the authors that talks about the why in the corporate world and how important it is. But we have to be careful there because my experience has been that in many companies, the why simply becomes because we have to reach the goal so we can make money.
Yeah.
And people don't. Most leaders or most managers don't understand that. That's not really inspiring. There's really something more than that. I remember once I was in a pharmaceutical company, and the manager was so aware of this that he wanted people to feel what was the purpose of what they were doing. This is a plant that made pacemakers for the heart, and he wanted his employees in this place to feel the real purpose of this, and he wanted them to see beyond numbers and money. What he did was he separated this day and invited some of the patients who had received those pacemakers that these people had fabricated with their own hands. And when that happened, there was a big wow. The serial number that they knew they were carrying in their heart was a serial number that person sitting over there worked on, and that one over there worked on. That made a big difference. And the big part came when the mother of one of those who were there stood up and said, I have a pacemaker in my heart, and my son was the one who worked on it.
Well, okay.
So it created a big impact in terms of purpose, beyond the money and the numbers of manufacturing or anything like that. It's impactful when people see a reason beyond just money, or because we have to make shareholders richer or whatever.
Yeah, but purpose is also important. I mean, I have this conversation all the time. Is that I ask, what is your purpose? What is your purpose here? Why are you here? And people are, well, I need to make money to feed my family. Well, yes, but people don't hire you to make money to feed your family. They hire you to do a job.
But still, it has to do with meaning.
Yeah,
There has to be, and the leader has to provide something. I think that's Simon Sinek's major point in his book. Uh, Leaders have to make that purpose beyond the money stuff. If you cannot find or help people find that true meaning within them, what they're doing, then you're lacking as a leader. And if you as an employee can't find meaning what you're doing, then I seriously believe that even though the economy may not allow it, you should make plans to find a job that you actually like or enjoy doing, because you see something beyond money. Yes, we all want to make money, of course, but there has to be something else in there as well. The leader has to help provide that, and in a team, that's especially true.
and what about psychological safety? The how?
Yes, as I explained before, having an environment in that team where people know exactly what happens when someone makes a mistake, how we're going to deal with differences and the clashes and all these disruptive stuff that sometimes happens or always happens in a team, conflicts,
Right.
for example. When we understand how we are going to deal with that, that's a good starting point to give psychological safety. They have to feel safe that if they differ from the rest of the group, they're not going to be chastised for that. There's some interesting points because we don't have to all agree on something. In collaboration and consensus, I don't have to agree with 100% with everything everybody else says. All I have to do is say, listen, I wouldn't do it that way. I'm going to back this up, even though I would do it differently. That kind of thinking, that kind of psychological safety is what we're looking for.
Right.
So
that comes back to how you are dealing with this, comes back to the behavior you have defined for yourself as a leader or even as a direct report. That comes back to the behaviors we define. How are you going to deal with this and that? Those behaviors should have been defined already in terms of how you are dealing with anything.
Yeah, but that's what we've spoken so far. It has been defined for the individual.
Yes.
Now we have to define it for the team.
Right.
And it's not necessarily the same thing. The same process, we have to sit down and talk about it as a group and define our set of rules, that second wheel I talked about, that we have to agree upon. How are we going to handle differences of opinion, for example?
Right.
Everyone should feel safe. And again, when we deal with consensus and we deal with agreeing, we'll never agree 100% on everything. But we need to back up whatever we agree upon, that we're going to do, even if I feel that something has to be done differently. That psychological safety is important, not just for the individual, but as a group as a whole. That right. Within these 5, 6, 3, 4 people that are here, how can we all feel comfortable enough to say, you know what, I don't think you're doing enough for the team. I resent what you did here. Being that kind of honest. And it's an extension of the honesty and the assertiveness that we mentioned before that you're supposed to have with your boss. You should continue to have it now, not just with your boss, but with everyone else on the team. Okay,
Edwin. So on the topic of diversity and understanding diversity in terms of clarifying psychological safety, this is not about race. It's about attitudes, behaviors, work styles. That is diversity, I mean.
As hot as the race topic is at this moment, and it is very important, when we talk about diversity, yes, it's much more than that. When I talked about psychological safety, I tried to bring that up because diversity means, okay, look at all these different backgrounds, look at all these different personalities, look at all these different mindsets, all these different unconscious biases. it's thinking that there's value in having different people in your team. Actually, there have been some studies conducted where they found that diversity brings a diverse group is usually 20% more productive than a non-diverse group, in whatever sense you want to understand the term. So in many global companies, they're driving this diversity concept because they know that just by the fact that we recognize diversity in a group, we can be 20% more productive. Think about that for a second. Let that sink in. Just the fact that you have a diversity of whatever in your group makes it more productive. And it's also true in decision making, because if everyone agrees with everything we all say, that's usually highly suspicious that something is not going well with a group.
Yeah.
There should be contradictions. So diversity plays a similar role. It brings different perspectives. So it brings up the quality of what we're doing and the productivity as well.
Yeah, and we also need the willingness from each individual to understand what somebody else wants to say, and that is important as well.
And it also helps us avoid, even remember when you talked about hiring people? When we hire someone, we usually have this template in our mind that we want to fit with what we want. Well, it's not what we like. It's sometimes better to hire people with diverse perspectives so that they can enrich whatever you're doing.
Yes,
that is especially critical in a team, not just hiring it for a company, but in your particular team as well. If you have too much of the same thing, you may want to push some people with some buttons to try to bring, because no one is the same really. Everyone brings something different. Right. So and put a focus on those differences and use them for the better of the team or for the synergy that we need to seek. So diversity becomes a very important point in this process, understood in that broader sense.
Now that we have the elements, how do we ensure that we can measure different dimensions or different characteristics of that team? I usually use the 5 dysfunctions of a team: trust, conflict, commitment, accountability, and results. I think that the questionnaire that comes with that book is very important for us to know where we stand right now. And then in 6 months, you could do it again, see where you stand, and what is preventing that improvement from happening.
That's a great contribution that Patrick Lencioni has given through his book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, because he gives us a specific way to measure where we're at as a group with those 5 elements that actually impede teams to achieve synergy. So you have, as you said, a way to measure those 5 dimensions, and in a couple of months later on, do it again and see what kind of adjustments have been done. It gives you particular areas where you can work with the team and try to find what kinds of behaviors and attitudes you need to improve upon so that you could do better in those disruptive areas. So it's a great contribution that Lencioni has provided there, and every leader out there, if they're really concerned about their team, they should take a look at it. I've used it with some of the teams I've worked with, and it's been great because in my case, we use it once a year after. And everyone was so pleased to realize that even though they thought they haven't gotten too far, in fact, there had been some changes. So that stimulated them to say, okay, wait a minute. We can do this.
Yes. I found that also. Because it develops a certain level of self-awareness that people maybe did not have before. People come with all kinds of behaviors from their childhood. And another analogy I like to use sometimes is that snow globe. Whatever experiences you have had in childhood, it's still shaken up in your mind. You still have these experiences fresh in your mind that are still affecting you, and it could affect any aspect of these 5 dimensions or dysfunctions.
That's why I like to use this case of psychometric testing. Right. Because I'm not a psychologist, so I observe human behavior a lot. I'm familiar with human behavior, but I'm not a psychologist, and therefore, if I can have an objective measurement that will bring out stuff that's in the person's biases and frame of mind and paradigms, would help us a lot to figure out how we can produce synergy with a group of people. Because yes, we carry all those baggages, we all do. And that's part of who we are. But how does that play in this particular team is a question that a leader should really make. That question is an important one. Even though we're not psychologists, it doesn't matter. We can still make those questions and find ways of trying to answer them as best we can.
Yeah, one other point I want to make on this is that first one, trust, is the most, because it leads to the others. It is the most important part. And one of the things that I always mention is, if I'm a leader and I'm in a room of let's say a boardroom, and I'm coming across in a way that is creating an environment that where others are afraid to speak up, and I see that often here. People may have an issue and they don't want to say anything because the leader is creating that environment. But without that conversation, or without direct reports feeling free to speak up, they leave the office, they leave the meeting, and they go and they speak negatively about the leader outside, and the leader goes away feeling, well, nobody said anything. Everything must be perfect outside. And so we have to, as leaders, encourage people to speak up. If you notice that you have maybe for example, a non-assertive person in the group, should the goal be to try to improve that level of assertiveness so that the direct report could at least say something later on, or in upcoming meetings where the leader has a good view of what is going on, so that it encourages other people to speak up as well. So there's more input from the rest of the team in any meeting.
It's a very good point that you bring up, because maybe no matter what I do, that person will never feel comfortable speaking out in front of people. In which case, I have to make sure that I get that input anyway.
Yes.
Okay? I don't want to make everyone the same. I don't want to work only on your weaknesses and forget about your strengths. Maybe that person doesn't want to speak out, period. But then as a leader, I need to seek out that. Maybe he wants to speak alone on that subject. Fine.
But what if they have
the other team members? Excuse me?
What if they had a good idea? You will never know.
No. What I'm saying is, you would have to find a way to get that input from that person.
Right.
Because you're supposed to have that trust with that person individually, because you're their boss, if they don't feel comfortable talking with the group. So what I'm saying is, I cannot push him to be extrovert if he doesn't want to be that, to give you an example. But I can. My first goal is to try to make them comfortable speaking there, because it's a necessity. They need to speak out, and the others need to. But if I cannot do that, then I have to find a way to have the input of that person considered in the process, and bring it into the team somehow. What I'm trying to get at is that, in your point, you're saying, yes, we have to make an effort to bring all those elements out. That's right. But I'm not going to make weaknesses the main point of my development for the team.
Of course,
I want to develop strength. So maybe that's not his strength. Okay, what is his strength? What is he bringing in? So let him slide on that one. We'll try to find, maybe we need to, each one of us sit with him alone, and he'll feel comfortable speaking with each one of us alone. And it'll work that way. You see my point?
Yes. To close off the topic and to give some recommendations, what are some things that you think we could use?
First of all, I think that we need to see if we are simply driving the people that are working with us to achieve the level of competency that they need for whatever they're doing and nothing else, or is it that we're doing something, or we are recommending, or we are what are we doing that needs synergy, so that I can actually put my focus into trying to produce more than the sum of its parts. That's a basic question, I think, that has to be in the mind of a leader. Otherwise, if it's not necessary, I'm not advocating that every single group of people has to work as a team.
Yes, that's true.
No. Some group of people are just that, a group of people working, and as long as each of them produce a level of efficacy or efficiency that they need, it's fine. Yes. But there are groups of people, when they run something, when they do something, when they make something, that you need to produce synergy. You need to sit back and say, okay, how do I produce synergy here? How can the result can be bigger than the individual contributions added up? That's the first thing I would think of in this subject, really. And I don't think that many people out there talk about that. And then another thing that I should keep in mind is that it's not just the three elements that you mentioned: purpose, clarity, and psychological safety. we need to discuss those elements. We need to as a group now, just as we said with the individual, you need to clarify expectations. It's the same conversation, but now I'm going to have it with a group. But we need to come to terms with that, and we need to agree on certain set of rules and certain processes in order to have our roles clarified,
Yes,
in order to have the goals as clear as possible. So that's a really ongoing conversation. If it's a long-term team, some of those things may change with time. So we need to clarify and rectify as we move along with those things. So it's an ongoing conversation with the group as well.
Right, and those conversations need to be regular as well.
Yes. So that's why I want people to remember that there's still part of performance management. We're thinking in terms of a team, but it's still the same principles apply. And we're just trying to have this conversation and an agreement with 3, 4, 5, or 10 people, but still it's part of that frame of performance management, the performance management process that we've been talking about.
Obviously, teamwork is a huge subject, and we couldn't touch on every single item. So we decided to focus on just some key things that could help you to move forward with your team. And I hope you enjoy it. Please subscribe, share with your friends and colleagues, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, Edwin.
My pleasure.